Hello, my name is ANEKA from Made to Sew, and welcome to today's tutorial where I'm going to be sharing tips and techniques for sewing princess seams. I'm going to be showing you how to sew a princess seam from the armhole, but the same rules apply if you're creating a princess seam from the shoulder. We're going to look at whether you should stay stitch your princess seams, when that can be useful, how to sew them on the machine, basting and tacking tips, and then finally pressing and clipping the curves so that you have a beautiful princess seam at the end. It doesn't matter what pattern you're working with for this tutorial, you should be able to follow along and apply the rules that I teach you here on your chosen pattern. So collect up your supplies and we can get started. Please begin by cutting your chosen pattern out of your fabric. Now you can see here for this sample, I have got a centre front piece that was cut on the fold and two side front pieces. The princess seam that I'm working with in this sample starts at the armhole and curves over the apex of the bust. But it doesn't matter if you're working with a princess seam that starts in the armhole or the shoulder. The techniques we cover will be the same. In the majority of princess seam patterns, the side panel will be curved. It curves out for the bust, in for the waist, and back out again for the hip. The centre front panel has a much smoother shape and doesn't tend to curve in and out like the side front panel does. This depends on your pattern to some extent, how fitted the pattern is, and what size your bust is. Larger cup sizes will have a larger shape here on this curve. So if you're working with a pattern that has a multi-cup size, you will see that picking the larger cup sizes will give you a larger curve shape over the princess seam. Now, if you do need to make a full bust or small bust adjustment to your princess seam, I will have tutorials on how to do that next week. Now, there are different schools of thought as to whether the stitching line on the side front should measure the same as the stitching line on the centre front. I personally believe that both of them should measure the same. However, there are times when I will have a little bit of discrepancy there, and because of the bias curve of the side front, you can get away with this. In most commercial dressmaking patterns, you will find that they incorporate some ease. So with this example, I have incorporated some ease. By ease, I mean there is a difference between this seam and this seam, and I'll be showing you how to distribute it. Once you've cut out your fabric, I would like you to mark any notches or details you have on the pattern that need to be recorded onto the fabric. On the wrong side of the fabric, you're going to want to mark the notches like I've done here. I've got one above the bust and one at the waist. I've marked these in black carbon paper, but I'm actually going to go over them in Sharpie. I'm not planning on wearing this garment. This is simply for demonstration purposes, and I want to make sure you can really clearly see those notches. Now, for reference, the fabric I'm working with here is 97% cotton, 3% elastane. It doesn't matter what fabric you're working with, as the same rules apply. To make it nice and clear which is the wrong side of the garment, I have marked my notches and I've also put my stabilizing tape around the neck instead of stay stitching. I thought that it would be clearer to do this with a plain fabric than a patterned fabric so that you can clearly see how I'm manipulating these seams. But unfortunately, I don't have a plain fabric that has a different colour on the front and the back. Now, the placement of your notches on your pattern may be different to on mine. Please don't worry about the position of them. The key with the notches is that they will match to another notch and we will distribute ease in between the notches. Now, the first thing that you might need to think about is whether you need to stay stitch. Now, stay stitching is completing a very small stitch length, 1.5 millimeters in length, and you do it as close to the stitching line as possible, but in the seam allowance. So the pattern that I'm working with here has 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters seam allowance. Therefore, I would stay stitch 4/8 or half an inch away from the edge, or 1.2 centimeters. Now, your pattern may ask you to stay stitch an area. It will generally be between notches or circles. And the reason it's asking for you to stay stitch is because The pattern pieces that you have cut out incorporate curves, which means that you have the bias of the fabric. If you handle it too much, you can stretch the fabric out of shape. So stay stitching is going to help prevent that, just like the stay tape that I've got around the neckline here. My personal opinion is that I generally wouldn't stay stitch my princess seams. This is simply because when I've worked with the garment manufacturers, they haven't. But I do agree that there is a time and a place for it. Depends on your fabric, and it also depends on your level of sewing, how much handling this is going to take, how tricky it's going to be for you to insert your princess seams. So for this tutorial, I have decided to complete one side with a stay stitch and the other side without. So I'm going to stay stitch on my front panel because this is the bit that I really do not want to stretch. Some patterns will ask you to do it on the front and the side, some will just ask you to do it on the front. We're going to do it in between the notches, and we're going to do it 4/8, so half an inch, or 1.2 centimeters away from the edge. Join me at the sewing machine now and I will show you how to do it. Now I've begun at the first notch and I'm doing a really small stitch length, 1.5 millimeters in length, and I'm doing this as close to my stitching line as possible, which is half an inch, 4/8, or 1.2 centimeters if you're working with 1.5 centimeter seam allowance from the edge of the fabric. And you just want to do this all the way until you get to the next notch. And you can backstitch to secure your stitches. Obviously you can do this where your pattern suggests. And there you can see my stay stitching. So as I mentioned, I've done this on one side and not on the other, just so that you've got both options. Now I'm going to show you how to pin the seam here together. Got my pins ready. So I've turned my fabric pieces around so that you can see as I pin the whole of this seam here. I've got the right sides of my fabric together. The pin is now marking the right sides. Please bear in mind that I wouldn't normally pop a pin in the center of my fabric like this. This is simply to show you which is the right side of the fabric clearly. If I wanted to mark the right side of my fabric, I would either place a pin in the seam allowance, or I would generally use chalk to mark the wrong side and put a W or something like that on the wrong side of the fabric. So let's begin. We're going to need to start by pinning the bottom edges together. I am using my silk pins for this, but you don't need to. Obviously, I'm not actually working with silk fabric. It's more because they show up nicely for you. One at the bottom and one at the top. Now, the top is where people can sometimes have a difficulty because princess seams can often, depending on the pattern you're working with, have long points coming off them. And sometimes people are unsure how to actually match the edge of the fabric. So a little tip here is that you complete something called pin basting. Now, pin basting is a technique that I often use. If you've watched some of my other tutorials, you will know that I'm a big fan of pinning either on the stitching line or in the seam allowance in the direction that you're going to be stitching. So the head of the pin faces you, meaning it's easy for you to remove. Now, if you pin that, and I'm just going to check that the width of my tape measure measures 5/8, 1.5 centimeters, my seam allowance with this garment, I'm happy with that. If I then open this up, I can then see that actually I have got a nice smooth armhole there. I haven't got any extra bit of seam allowance sticking out. If the seams have been trued correctly, that should be the case. If you are still worried about this, or another method you can use is to take a ruler and a chalk pen, or some chalk, or a pen, a removable pen of some description, and to measure in your seam allowance from the edge of the fabric and from the top edge and from the armhole. And it will then give you a sort of crossroads as to where the top of the seam is going to be. If we're to do that to this bit as well, let me flip that over, because we need two of these to line up. I could do it here. And again, I'm going to have a little crossroads. And then if I turn that back around again, back to where we were, I would grab a pin, position the pin through on the crossroads on this side of the fabric. And then I would position the pin through on the crossroads on the other side of the fabric. And that is effectively doing the same thing. Then again, I have got a nice finish there. So far we've pinned the bottom and we've pinned the top. We now want to pin the notches. So I'm going to position those in place. And again, I generally will do my pin basting, especially when I've got something like a princess seam or two difficult seams that I'm trying to get together. Either I will pin on my stitching line or just inside it. It allows me to know that if my pins have gone in like this, it will be possible for me to sew this on the machine without any puckers or gathers. If you're pinning sideways, which some people like to do, it's just not my preference, you can find that you can ease a lot more. So it works, and then you go to the sewing machine and you can't actually sew it in position like that. So just another little tip. Right, we've done the notch here. We need to do the notch up here. And again, I've marked these with Sharpie. You obviously wouldn't do that with your garment. And then what we need to do. So this area here is the key area that we're going to need to ease between the two notches. And that's pretty much always the case when it comes to a pattern. So this below the waist marking, I haven't really got any ease. So I'm just going to distribute that nicely. Obviously, the edges of my fabric are always lining up here, and I'm just distributing that. If you would like to draw your seam allowance on here so that you're pinning on that line and that you're joining the two lines together, you're more than welcome to do that. Some people, again, find that that makes a nice and easy technique. So, what do we do about this little tricky bit? Well, the key thing when it comes to easing is, and if you've seen my sleeve tutorial, you will have heard me explain this before. We're going to pick the middle part of one curve and take it to the middle part of the other. You don't need to measure it, you just need to approximately do this. And the key here is that we're just manipulating the fabric. So middle to middle. Now this part, I will do again, middle to middle. And I will keep working my middle to middle theory until I have got rid of any easing. And you can sort of manipulate the fabric a little bit over your hands here. So you can sort of smooth it out. As I said, those two edges or the raw edges need to be in line with one another. There we go. And just, you know, gradually tweak it if you need to. If you're not happy with it, then move it. And again, middle to middle. And actually, that hasn't been too difficult. The key here, in my opinion, is to pin like I'm pinning. I know it might be different for you if you normally pin horizontally, but I promise it will allow you to see that if the pin goes in, it will sew. If there is a gather or a pleat either side of the pin, it doesn't matter. As long as the pin is in and there isn't a pleat through the pin, then you will be able to sew it without a pleat. And then we can take a look. And because I have completed the pin basting method, and actually that isn't looking too bad, and this is designed for quite a fitted garment, I have incorporated the waist dart with this princess seam. So the next step would be to sew this. I'm going to show you a closer up of the other side where I've got the stay stitching, and I'm also going to clip into this with the stay stitching just to show you what you would do if the pattern that you're working with was being very tricky. Perhaps you had made a full bust adjustment, you had a really large curve to deal with, then this is where the stay stitching can be used again, because you can stay stitch and clip, and I will show you that now. So I have pinned from the hem up to the waist notch and from the top down to the notch here. The curve is the tricky bit. So as I said, if you've got a really big curve, your fabric perhaps is difficult, there might just be too much ease in your pattern, what do you do? This is where the stay stitching can also come in. whether your pattern suggests that you do it or not, if you're having trouble, I would recommend that you stay stitch. Then you can take a little pair of scissors. Now, for the side that hasn't got enough fabric, so that's going to be this straighter seam here, you can snip in. So we're going to do straight snips towards, but not through, the stay stitching. And that stay stitching is just to help secure everything here, stop you from obviously cutting all the way through it as well. And that will just release that bit of fabric a little bit. If you're still having trouble, you can stay stitch the side front. Your pattern may even ask you to do that. In those circumstances, you would, rather than take a straight cut, you would actually cut a V out because there is too much fabric here. But for now, let's hope that this works. I will be showing you the clipping in terms of cutting straight or cutting a V out when we press these shortly. And again, middle to middle. As always, that's always my technique for easing. Middle of one to middle of other. And you will see that actually this has gone in super easy now that we have clipped the other side. I'm not really having to manipulate it at all. And just please always make sure that the two edges of your fabric match up. I see a lot of people do this and they just let one bit of fabric sort of slip over to get away with it and to be able to sew the seam together. That's not the case. The whole point is that the edges of the fabric should match up. Stitching lines that were designed to be together should be together. If you're working with a fabric that is very tricky, perhaps it's slippy, perhaps it's stretchy, then it won't harm to baste your seam. So here I'm using a cotton basting thread and I am stitching on or just off my stitching line. And that will just help to hold everything together, ready for you to sew it on the machine. It also means you can take your pins out, so if you're worried about having to do lots of things at once, that can be useful. Keep the stitches to 1/4 inch, 5 mm in length, a nice snug basting or tacking stitch. So whether you have basted or tacked your seams, or if they're just pinned, we can now go to the sewing machine. Now, one of the questions that I always get asked is, how should I run this seam through the sewing machine? Partly because the method that I would always teach is to sew from the hem up when it comes to any other seams. But what should you do on a princess seam? Now, I was always taught that the pattern piece that had the largest amount of ease, or that needed help to be eased into a seam, should be positioned against the feed dogs. So that should go on the bottom of the machine. And in this case, it would be the side front. It needs help to be eased into the center front. And that's the same rule that I apply with sleeves. Although that's the method I was taught, and it's still a method that I would personally apply, I understand that everyone has their own way of doing something. And as long as you're running this through the sewing machine, sewing your seam allowance accurately and not getting any puckers or pleats, then I am happy. Now I've lined up the edges of my fabric on the seam allowance for this pattern. That's 5/8 inch, 1.5 centimeters. And the reason I've used that seam allowance is because that's probably what your pattern will be using. However, I would always suggest that if you can reduce your seam allowance, or if you're working with a pattern that's got a smaller seam allowance, it does make sewing princess seams easier. My preference would be 3/8 or 1 centimeter. Now I'm back to my normal stitch length here, 2.5 millimeters, and I've done a forwards and backwards to secure it. You will see I am working with black thread. That is simply because it will show up nicely for you. Now I'm working my way around the curve. I have got my front panel on the top. As I mentioned, that's the way that I prefer to sew this. And I'm also not using my dual feed or my walking foot, so that the layer underneath is being moved by the feed dogs. And the key here is really just to hold everything nice and flat. You want to get your hands nice and close here so that you can feel if there are any puckers or pleats underneath. And I often sort of check underneath as well as I'm moving this through the machine. I don't sew over my pins, so I will take them out as I near them and firmly hold everything in place. Now, as we start to work around the curve, you want to really get your fingers nice and close in here, because what you want to be doing is smoothing out the area that you're planning on stitching. If there is a pucker or a ruffle either side of this area, it's fine. Where the needle goes in is where there mustn't be a pucker or a ruffle or a pleat. And just keep working your way around and keep checking underneath. I will normally have one hand that checks underneath and one hand that checks on top all of the time when I'm sewing. The minute I feel a pucker, I will have a little look, smooth it out, and do the next section. And you can just do this all the way along. Keep doing it step by step. You don't need to rush a princess seam. If you're ever really worried, position the needle in, lift the foot up and take a look. Did you miss it? Did you catch it? Are you okay? Foot back down again and continue. Or if perhaps you have caught a pucker, then take it out then and there, and then you don't have to take it out again when you finish sewing it. So the key is to be patient. Don't rush it. The seams have been sewn and I have trimmed my threads and removed any of the basting or tacking stitches. Now the next step is to press your princess seams. So we're going to be discussing pressing and also clipping so that you can achieve a nice flat finish to the seams here. The one thing you're going to need to press the seams, or I would recommend, is a ham. Now, the idea is that the ham is shaped like 3D areas of the body, apparently, but it will mean that you can get a nice shape around the bust. I tend to use the ham on its edge or on its side for actually pressing princess seams. If you don't have one of these, then you can roll up a towel. You want something that's going to absorb the steam. The ham is filled with sawdust, so it pulls the steam through into the ham, which obviously a towel would also help with. Now, most of the time I will press my seam flat prior to pressing it open or to one side or the other. I work my way along, pressing over the stitching, using a nice amount of steam. And this just helps to get everything to sit nicely and flat as well. Helps to get the stitches to sit between the layers of fabric. To press the seam allowances open, I'm going to position the ham underneath the seam. Now I tend to position the ham on its side when pressing princess seams. You just want the ham to sort of mimic the shape of the princess seam. Now I'm going to press the princess seam open here without clipping the seam, because I want to show you what will happen if you don't clip the seam properly. You should be able to see that one side of the princess seam, there is too much fabric, so it's almost looking a little bit puckered. On the other side, and this is simply because this was the side that I showed you how to clip the stay stitching, the clips are actually opening up. So let's look at the rules there. Now I recommend clipping prior to pressing. However, you may find that whilst pressing, you do need to add some more clips into different areas to make sure that the seam lays flat. Now I haven't pressed this side yet here, and you can see that the front panel is very tight. It really won't sit open. So because it is tight and it won't sit open, I need to cut into it, straight cuts towards the seam. And by doing this, they're going to allow it to open up. So when I'm cutting it, you can see that they're opening up as V's. The number of these that you need depends on the curve and the shape. Sometimes you need more than others. But approximately perhaps every inch, 2.5 centimeters apart is a good sort of starting point. And there we go. I'll do another one. So the rule with this is if you have a concave curve, then you need to cut straight into it. If you have a convex curve, so an outwards shape, then we need to actually trim away fabric. There is too much fabric here on this side. So rather than just cutting little snips in, we're actually going to cut V's of fabric away. And you want to sort of cut the V's where the fabric is looking like it doesn't want to be there, or there's too much fabric, should I say. So again, here, it looks like there's a bit too much. So this doesn't have to be neat. Obviously, make sure you don't cut through your original stitching line, and just work your way around doing that. But that is the rule. So the rule is a concave, you will cut straight in, a convex, and you will cut out like this. And this will allow the seam, now with a nice press, to sit flat. You should only really need to do it over the curved parts. So that will be over the bust. I'll probably have to do a little bit over the waist as well, because this is looking a little bit tight. I might just need to do a few snips in there to release it. And you just want to use a nice sharp pair of scissors. And that's looking really nice. Now, again, if you had a smaller seam allowance here, this perhaps wouldn't be quite as noticeable. So just something to remember. But most of the time with a curve on a princess seam, you will need to do something, especially if you want to press the seam open. Now your pattern may ask for you to press the seam to one side, and that is also fine. I've seen patterns ask for it to be pressed to the centre front and to the side front. Both methods are fine. They're just going to give you a different look and a slightly different result. So I'm going to continue pressing the seam on this side. Obviously, I need to position this on the edge to get right in there. And you really just want to make sure that you're pressing right into the seam. We don't want to have any pleats or puckers on the front of the garment. If you're getting pleats or puckers on the right side, then I would recommend pressing from the right side of the garment here as well. If your fabric is delicate, please use a pressing cloth. You don't have to press your princess seams open. If your pattern wants them to be pressed in a particular manner, then you're welcome to do that. It may press them towards the centre front or towards the side front. Taking a look from the right side, we can see a nice smooth princess seam. Press it again from the front if you need to, using a pressing cloth. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you now feel more confident sewing princess seams in the future. Stay tuned for tips for completing a full bust adjustment and a small bust adjustment on princess seams in the coming weeks. Thanks for watching and see you soon.